Well, I will call the CHIP meeting to order. Thank you all for joining us. And just for the record, if the CHIP members could state their name and say present. Tim Davis, present.
George Baumgarten, present.
Mike Sardina, present.
And I know our harbor master is here as well. Thank you. We have a lot to cover, but let me just frame this a little bit. This is a somewhat unusual CHIP meeting. I've invited a number of people to join us for it. And we really want to accomplish two things. One, if people are ready to vote on the minutes, I know some people probably have only, Mike, you probably only recently got them. I don't know if you've seen them enough to vote on them. Are you comfortable voting on them, Mike? Okay, you're still on mute, but okay, so am I. So why don't we take both of the minutes that George has submitted. May I hear a motion, Mike, from you, seeing to approve the minutes?
I make a motion that we approve the minutes that for October and for November.
I second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
There we go. Thank you. Now on to the meat of it. As most of you know, I'm sure, the Harbor Committee and the CHIP working group have authorized a separate small group comprised of George and Lisa, with the rest of us filling in where we can to start to look at harbor climate resiliency. I have had many conversations with others in the community about the impact of climate change on the rest of the town. It is very much part of the Master Plan Implementation Committee interest. And over the course of the next several years, there are going to be many of us working to identify the risks, identify the vulnerabilities, and identify how we can improve the resiliency of various infrastructures in the town. Our primary task here is in the harbor, and to look at the vulnerabilities in the harbor, the infrastructure, and how we can improve them and prepare for the storms to come. So with that, we have been able to call on a local expert in this area. We have plenty of us who have some knowledge. I think with help from a dictionary, I can spell resiliency, but we have an expert, Tom Bell, who has been a huge help on a lot of projects. Excuse me. So we've asked Tom to today to help frame the discussion, the conversation, if you will, on what we're going to be looking at as we move through this process. And I think probably the best thing, and George, I'm going to turn this over to you as the working chair of this group, you and Lisa. But I think if we can help Tom get started and frame this, that will be the primary topic of this meeting. And with that, I will turn it over to you, George.
Thanks, Tim. And I'm wondering, Lauren, I'd like to share screen. I think I'm able to. It looks like I can. Then I'm just going to share my screen briefly. Can you see the Harbor Climate Resilience Initiative?
Yes.
Thank you. So Lisa Hewitt Dick and I have been, I guess, volunteered at an October Harbor Committee meeting to lead a Harbor Climate Resilience Initiative. And we've had a number of discussions and things, actually pretty excited about it. And what I'm trying to do is really set the stage for, yes, Tim, to have Tom Bell speak a little bit about his planning. But before we get there, so what the plan is for the Harbor Committee to sponsor a series of 3 to 4 public forums in January, February, March, and maybe into April to explore aspects of the harbor climate resilience. And again, I don't read through this. Tim did send out this document to, I think, everybody on this meeting, so I won't go through it in detail, but a couple things I will point out. So our objective as part of this initiative is to build consensus among stakeholders, that's people here as well as people in the public, prioritize future actions, increase knowledge, and available resources to inform action plans related to Cohasset Harbor. Very importantly, we're not doing this alone. We're coordinated with Lauren, with Chris Senior, Brianna, and others. We want to complement a townwide summit that the town will be sponsoring with some of the other committees potentially represented here today, targeted around Earth Day, and again, just conjecture, but it may involve alternative energy, open space, master planning, and others. So we're essentially, introducing this for the harbor related activities and trying to keep our scope focused on that. Our plan is that we will be running these forums out of Wilkett Commons and via Zoom, so that at the moment, that looks like that'll work. One way or another, if we couldn't meet in person, we'll meet via Zoom. So the plan is to move forward. Just to put a little bit more context around it, and I would invite discussion on this, so we'll just leave a little bit of time for Q&A. Our proposed sessions are lead off in January with Tom Bell and Jack Buckley speaking around issues related to extreme storms, whether they be a storm surge coming in from the ocean, or whether it be a huge rainfall event and the stormwater that happens from there. So our expectation is we'll have Jack and Tom speak, and maybe some other introductory speakers for around 45 minutes, followed by 45 minutes of Q&A. That's the format we're trying to follow for all the meetings. Following that, we're still in discussions, but we'll work with Lauren Lind and other town officials. We would like to hear sort of the current state, present state from town officials' point of view, and really leading off from the MVP analysis that was performed in 2018 and 2019, and sort of rekindling that thought as well as extending it based on present day knowledge. But areas near the harbor, sewer treatment plant, the water department wells, the police and fire department building, all of which we'll see from Tom and Jack, are potentially at some risk if there were an extreme storm. And then we're pretty excited. Lisa has helped coordinate with Joan Moschino, who is our representative, and potentially we could have others, but she would love the opportunity to speak with us around funding opportunities and the view from the legislative side around how Cohasset could fund certain solutions that we may come up with. That kind of thing, she will be closely coordinated with Chris Senior and others in terms of supporting the work of the town. But we think that's the format for this series.
George, if I could just interject here, and Lisa, if you were going to be coordinating some of these visitors to speak and meet with us, if you could add some folks from Situate, either from their board, or I know Joan and Patrick represent Situate, but to have somebody from their select board as part of this effort would be terrific.
It's a great idea, Tim. Thank you for adding it.
So look, just Tom, that was a setup for you. But before we jump in, I would invite: are there comments or observations? This is fairly quick, but comments or observations about the course that we're trying to take. Questions for Lisa or me?
George, I think this is great. This is a great start. I'm sure it will take many twists and turns in the road as we move through it, but it's a great start. Thank you.
Let me say, I do see Peter. You've raised your hand. You're on mute, but Peter, what's your question?
If you're going to add Situate, I was wondering if it wouldn't be appropriate to also add a Hull representative, since I was at a climate change study presentation a couple of years ago for the town. And while we were only going to experience about a 5% loss of land, or, that could be vulnerable, Hull was going to experience 47% of its landmass to be inundated. So, their planning, I would think, is much further ahead than ours, and we may be able to learn something from them.
Thank you, Peter.
Good idea.
I would add to what Peter said by mentioning that Hull, of course, has built a very large seawall, or expanded their seawall along Atlantic Avenue through Crescent Beach. And the finished elevation of the top of that seawall is 12.8 feet. That's a number that we all should keep in mind here, I think. It's the FEMA recommended height for these sorts of things.
Other questions or comments? Well, thank you. And I
Does
see.
Peter have his hand up again, or is that he just didn't take it down?
Oh, no, I just didn't take it down. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. There we go.
So let me just in introducing. So we're furthest along in this presentation series with some work that Tom Bell and Jack Buckley have been doing. What our expectation today is that Tom and Jack each give sort of separately the premise of their discussion, and we're not going to do the presentation, but to describe it overall, and would love for each of you to listen carefully. And again, if questions, comments, observations that can help steer their presentation are invited, with the idea of, again, the forum is about harbor climate resiliency and, exploring the dimensions of that again. And we're inviting as much comment as we can as we head into the presentation. And before I finish off, Lisa Hewitt-Dick, do you have any questions or comments to add before we hand the floor to Tom?
I think you did a great job covering it. Thank you. The clarifying question I would ask is when Tim and Peter suggested that we have individuals from the other municipalities, do you mean by that, Tim, that you'd want somebody to be part of the program, or just shall we really just make sure that they're included in the presentations?
Well, thanks, Lisa. I would suggest that it really depends on them. I think that as Tom pointed out, there's a lot of expertise already in Hull, and so that's good. I have no idea what Situate has been doing, but to have them engaged, I think, as I mentioned earlier, we have to get a governance agreement with them in order to do anything. So to have them engaged would be great.
Okay.
If they have expertise, Lisa, if they have expertise and would like to speak to this, I'd certainly welcome that.
Sure.
But if they just want to listen in, that would be fine too.
Okay, we can talk offline about who to reach out to specifically, but thank you, that's helpful.
So with that,
could I just add a point to that? Sorry.
go ahead, Ellen.
I just wanted to add that I do know that my counterpart in Situate, who's the current planning director, he previously had been the coastal resource officer for Situate and then stepped up into planning director. So I'd be happy to reach out to him as a peer and see if he might be interested in participating in this.
And Lauren, what's that person's name?
Kyle Boyd.
Thank you.
So thank you. So Tom, would you mind giving us a preview of what your proposed discussion is about?
Sure. Let me start by saying that the Municipal Harbor Plan has a section in it that authorized the town and Situate to go out and get a contractor to do a climate action under the climate action grant program to do an analysis of storm tide surge. And so that's sort of what kicked this off. And I think this was done, Lauren, you can probably help me with this, the dates, but at least in the report, it says June 2019 is when this was, this funding was received. And then the contractor is the Center for Coastal Studies in Provincetown. They did a marvelous job of actually modeling the storm tide. I'm going to need to be able to share my screen, Tim.
Yeah, Lauren, can you give Tom?
Or, yeah, Lauren.
Yes, you should have ability.
Okay, great. So let me go there. And so they created this document that is really some great work, I think. And it's fairly technical. It's great for me. I think that for, and probably for others here, but as far as presenting this to the public, it's sort of dense. So I took it on myself to acquire their data by just basically phoning them up and saying, can I have these shapefiles, and incorporated them into my own town geographic information system.
You didn't have to hack into their computers, Tom?
No, fortunately not. Well, actually, they said that it was going to be posted on their site, and that's where I started. If I could just go in there and download it, but I couldn't. So I talked to the lead author, who is, I don't remember his name.
Is it Mark Borelli?
Yeah, Mark Borelli. And he was generous enough to just pass that on to me as an attachment. So let me move my screen over here. Move this over here. So you should be looking at my screen one.
Oh, we can't see your screen yet.
There we go. Okay, so as part of that process, as I pointed out, the CCS document is fairly dense, and the visualization, the graphics in it are pretty rudimentary. So that's really what prompted me to download the data and sort of embellish it a little bit, and then use that information to start to assess the economic impacts and impacts to infrastructure in town should there be a storm that was somewhat larger than our storm of record, which is the blizzard of 2018. Many of us got down to the harbor and around Little Harbor and Straits Pond and along the coast to have a look at what was happening in real time. So I'm sure many of you remember how close the water came to the top of, or actually flooded Margin Street and came pretty close there on border. So this map then is what I actually prepared, and these data over here are the different levels that CCS produced. And I'm only really going to focus on 3 of them because otherwise it gets way too complicated. But basically, they started here at mean high water, and which is here represented in the dark blue. And they then added in 1 foot increments. They added additional flooding areas. Now, obviously, this does not flood at high tide, because there's a tide gate right here. But you'll see what I use that for in just a second. Let's see, let me find the right layer now that I've turned it off. I think that's it right there. Yeah, more or less. Let me try one more just to be sure. Oh, that's it right there. Okay, so the storm of record basically is a concept that's used to explain or to document the highest observed or measured storm, accurately measured storm that we've encountered. Let me give that a little tweak and then back. And that would be, previously had been the hurricane of 1938, I believe. And so now, as of 2018, that was superseded by the hurricane of 2000 or the nor'easter of 2018. Sorry about this, but okay. So when I start to turn these back on, so this sort of works incrementally. So the dark areas, remember, this is high tide, and then and that's at an elevation of 4.76 feet above the North American vertical datum. Just as an aside, tides are linked to mean lower low water, which is the average of the lowest tide of the day for a tidal epoch of 19 years. It's not something I'm going to want to talk about in public, but just for your information, there are two datums here that we have to worry about. The first one is mean lower low water, which is a local datum only in Cohasset Harbor. And then there's a global data or a North American datum called North American vertical data from 1988. I've converted everything to NAVD 88 because all of our elevations above sea level are in that reference to that datum. So all the tides, all the storm surges now in this map are referenced to a single datum. It reduces confusion and actually allows us to visualize the impacts. So here's our high tide areas, Little Harbor and around Cohasset Cove and Cohasset Harbor. The storm surge of 2018 are this somewhat paler line that would be superimposed on top of this. So that would be about 5 feet deep right here in this dark area now. So that gives you some notion of what would happen had there been a bigger aperture at the tide gate, which was stuck open initially because apparently the generator wouldn't run, and so they couldn't close it. But had there been a larger aperture, it would have flooded to clear into here. This is the Elms Meadow well. This is the wastewater treatment plant. This is the public safety building. It would have flooded very close to all of these things. In fact, the wastewater treatment plant would have been close to 5 feet underwater had it actually been able to penetrate. Fortunately, they got that closed. I think they got an emergency generator down there in time and closed that up. So then the next series of even paler blue lines, which is another, adds another, let me look at this, another 5 feet to it. So this is 10 feet above high tide level. So the depth here now becomes 15 feet. The circumstances, this is the most extreme storm tide surge that was mapped by CCS. And it's approximately equivalent to what would happen if Sandy struck Cohasset instead of New York. So it's really an equivalent sort of thing. And the reason I use these historic storms, I think, to illustrate anything here is because people can relate to this. They can't say, oh, well, that's hypothetical. Well, it is hypothetical that a hurricane could, the size of Sandy, could strike Cohasset, but on the other hand, it did strike New York. So it's not that far outside of people's imagination. We could talk about sea level rise. We can talk about stronger storms and all that, which I'll allude to, but I think I want to base the argument on what's already been measured here in New England and at least the Northeast coast, so that people don't have that feeling of, well, it can't happen here. That's the sort of thinking that we really don't want to promote. So you can see that it would be fairly extensive, and again, this would be a nor'easter is probably not capable of doing this, at least so far. 2018 was a pretty powerful storm. There have been some others in our history. I was just down in the Historical Society today, looking through the records to see what else has happened in Cohasset, and there's some interesting things that are emerging from that. And I don't have much to say about it yet because I've got a lot more to do on it. But hurricanes, on the other hand, are certainly capable of doing this. And the double whammy with a hurricane is rainfall, of course. Our nor'easters tend to hit when it's colder, falls of snow. Even when we see 20 inches of snow, that 20 inches of snow, that's only about 2 inches equivalent of rain. So freshwater flooding on the west side of the harbor would probably not be a serious issue. During a hurricane where we might be talking about 8 to 12 inches or more of rain, then you're getting it from both sides. By the way, this is the boundary of the James Brook watershed here, which would starts obviously out towards Forest Avenue, et cetera, somewhere in that neighborhood. So the hurricanes are really what would do the most damage here. We're going to get it from the west and we're going to get it from the east. This is a little bit more harder to quantify, the storm surge. That requires a numerical model. I'm working on one. They're very complex. It's a lot of data that goes into them, a lot of calibration that's required. I may or may not have something to say about that by January. It's slow going, as it turns out. So I'm going to just focus on this right now. If I can talk about storm water runoff later, which is kind of fits right into this conservation concept, Conservation Commission authority, then I will do that if I can. So the real critical area for protecting town is right here. So our storm surge would overtop Margin Street and Border Street here. And if it got started, if let's say it was a foot higher than the storm of 18, then it probably wouldn't take very long to start ripping out lots of asphalt and deepening the channel. And this would just get worse as time went on. There's also a vulnerability here. Right, is this Black Horse Lane, and it's fairly shallow here. It's fairly low elevation here. These dots represent the elevation of the surrounding streets, and anything, and it's color coded just like any weather map might be. So the warmer colors, the reds, purples, oranges would be higher elevations. Yellow is lower, and green is lower yet. So you can see that these two areas right here are pretty serious, have some vulnerabilities, and as well as here. The aperture for the storm tide to enter the Gulf River is relatively small, so this is probably less of a worry unless the barrier here at Musquashicot Pond were to be breached. And as it turns out, it hasn't been breached before, but it's certainly been overtopped. And so then the water does, the storm surge could come down the Gulf River, and then this would be much more of an issue. That's where Scituate comes in. We need to know what they've got the same data. Tim, your idea to bring them in on it is really essential, because we're going to have to be partners in this to one degree or another, I suspect. So I created a document to run through all of this, and I'll just show you a couple of the some of the graphics that I've added to this for explanation. Let me move this over to my active screen. Just some simple explanations of what storm surge is, what sits on top of the storm surge, which is the waves. The storm surge itself does not include wave heights, so that just aggravates the situation. I'll make a point of that in a minute, another point about that in a minute. Another issue is reminding people of historic weather events. So I've got a small section on some historic nor'easters, and also the hurricanes that have hit as well. I want to emphasize topography, because it's both our vulnerability, and also perhaps it saved us a lot in the past, because most of our coast is elevated, far more so than Hull. As Peter pointed out, Hull has far more vulnerability, something like 50% of the town could get inundated. And we all know that we're familiar with reading in the paper about Situate and Marshfield also getting flooded. And Cohasset has escaped some of this, most of it, in fact, for decades. It's not to say we'll continue to be so lucky. So one of the things, another thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was the orientation of Cohasset Harbor and Cohasset Cove. There's a lot of shoal water here. This is from a SWAN model. It's a wave generation model for that this would sit on top of the storm surge. And you can see they've modeled it to 30 feet, which is pretty serious waves out here. But by the time they have come in here, made the corner, started into Cohasset Harbor, this is pretty shoal water. It's going to attenuate them rather quickly. So we're going to be talking about waves under even 30-foot waves out in the bay. It looks like waves of 5 feet and less would probably be what you would see within the harbor, and even less so within the cove. So we have some really good protection here. This doesn't do quite enough justice to it because we do have a lot of rocks out here, and all of the shoal water is essentially friction at the bottom of these waves and diminishes their force considerably by the time they get here. So our surge will be primarily calm water surge. It'll be the storm tide, actually. Will not be, we probably won't have to worry too much about waves being on top of it. There is a bit of fetch here. We could see, a couple of feet here, but the real problem is just rising water.
Tom?
Yeah.
Can you go back to that model for a minute?
Yeah.
It appears to me as though they've got the wind direction coming more from due east.
Yeah.
And of course, nor'easters, as we know, blow in from the northeast, which would then have a more direct impact on the harbor. The other thing too is, do you know what tide these datum were taken from?
They don't specify a tide, but yeah, 14. It's mean low water.
Mean low.
Yeah, this is mean low.
Okay. So an astronomically high tide obviously would have a greater impact.
Well, it would have less of it, be less able to attenuate the waves because you've got deeper water out here.
Yeah, right.
This is for a nor'easter model. You're not seeing the whole picture here. I just windowed this out of something that was prepared for the town of Hull when they were designing their seawall. So the orientation of the waves was to the northeast, and this is how they get curved around when they get down to us. This was just fortunately just right at the edge of the model.
Okay.
So I was able to, didn't have to go out and run this model myself. That they'd already done it. One of their contractors had already done it. If the wind were directly from the north, then of course the fetch is pretty small. It's basically Cape Ann to here. So it'd have to be oriented back around, and you might have more of an impact, but still there's an awful lot of shoal water here. And the farther the winds back to the north, and the less fetch you're going to have. So I don't think that this is a big issue. This is a 100-year storm return, which Sandy obviously would be a 100-year storm. And I don't recall whether the blizzard of 2018 was a 100-year storm or 500, but this is for a 100-year storm.
We're getting a lot of those 100-year storms these days.
Well, remember that doesn't mean they happen once every 100 years. I mean, there's one chance in 100 they will happen in this year. So,
I know.
That of course keeps a lot of people scratching their heads. Well, wait a minute, we've had 200-year storms in the last 5 years. Well,
right, so we're safe for another 100 years.
Yeah, right. We need to. That's something that needs to be clarified fairly early on, so people really start thinking it's the odds. It's not the interval between storms.
Right.
So then I have a little bit about mitigation, but then I swing right into these maps here. They're referred to in the report. And here's one of what happens to Little Harbor. George mentioned that I should pay attention to Hurricane Bob. Well, I just by pure good fortune, that was the last thing I looked at in the Historical Society, and I was reading a letter by one of the residents here where Sandy Beach was overwashed, and there was an assertion that there were very large waves cresting from this direction, cresting the Cat Dam. So these would be the flooded areas around Little Harbor. This is probably an exaggeration because, again, unless Sandy Beach is breached, this is going to throttle how much water actually can get into Little Harbor over the course of flood tide. But all bets are off if Sandy Beach were to be breached by large storms, large storm tides and waves. So then finally, there's obviously some issues here also at Straits Pond. This seawall now extends approximately from right here to here. It's 12.8 feet. They're hoping to prevent the serious overwash that they seem to get from a number of these storms. 2018 was really rough on them. 2015 might have been even worse for Hull. I was here then, and I remember there was a lot more debris in the pond after 2015 than there ever was after 2018. In fact, that 2015 event that happened after I'd been here about 6 years, and that's what got me interested in this. It really woke me up, seeing what happened at Straits Pond and also in Little Harbor, where the causeway got flooded. So I want to keep the graphics fairly succinct, so we can get through this in 15 minutes or less to leave time for questions and for other people to speak. One of the things that occurred to me that mitigation might be possible, maybe. Well, I want one more comment about this this area here. Let me talk about what the importance of the breakwater here and what that means for us. Again, it's probably useful from the standpoint of breaking any waves that come in here, but the problem is the storm tide's just going to make an end run through Briggs Harbor and go right around it. So there is no real possibility of building some kind of engineered structure here because this is an island, and the storm surge is going to go over this island, around it. So doing anything here other than perhaps raising it a little bit in hopes of attenuating storm waves somewhat is probably about all you could ever do here. Again, we need to be thinking about our topography as both our vulnerability, but also as a way. You can see that this goes all the way around here. I mean, there's kind of no stopping it if it's coming in from this direction. It's going to end up down here and get into town this way. And even as the tide went out, the water that accumulates in this part of the basin here is still going to be flowing this direction, even when it stops pouring in here, and for that matter, stops pouring in here. So it's not like when the tide turns, all of a sudden everything's going to be fine. It's not. So what I did was I took a look at our roads and envisioned them as polders, building polders, and a kind of a Dutch solution, and raising these roads, the road beds, probably incrementally. Every time we pave, we ought to think about laying down more road base and getting some of these 6.5 and to 7.5 foot sections up to at least as high as our storm of record, which is 9.76 feet. So up to about 10 feet. So some of these need probably 4 to 5 feet of road base to start to even begin to be of any value to protect us. Yellow's not too bad. This is what we need to bolster somewhat. You might only need to raise it a foot or two. As I said, Hull's raised theirs to 12.8 feet. And I think that that's probably a target that we should always keep in mind here. That's what it's going to take to protect us from the worst nor'easters we can imagine. And it's not going to be much protection. It's going to be some protection from a sandy-like event. Of course, all of this depends on when it happens and the timing of the tide, the duration of the storm. If the storm surge peaks at low water, we don't have nearly the problem we do if it peaks at high water, particularly during a king tide. A lot of us took a little tour down at the harbor 2 weeks ago and saw what 11 feet looks like. Well, if we had a 12-foot tide and then a 5-foot surge on top of that, it would be 17 feet, right? It's going to get farther than this. Let me rephrase that. The 12-foot tide is only a 5 feet. So no, I'd only take it to about 12 feet, something like that. Again, that datum of mean low water can catch you up when you're talking about mixing tides with storm tides and with topographic elevations. So that's about where I'm at right now. It's George has offered some excellent edits for me to incorporate, and I haven't gotten to it, but I will. And I hope to circulate a document to you guys within a few days.
This is great. Thank you, Tom. This is absolutely terrific. A couple of things that I just occur to me, and I really appreciate seeing Bassing's Beach and how important Bassing's Beach is as a barrier island, barrier beach to us. So in addition to the breakwater, we really have to look at all of Bassing's Beach and then into Briggs Harbor and figure out what if anything can be done there. And that's really why we need Situate. I think what occurs to me is, and I sat through the special town meeting last night, listening to the comments about the proposed zoning bylaw changes. What we really need to do here is to provide real information and education to the town and to all of our community. This is complicated stuff. If we're going to get it accurate, Tom has done a wonderful job here of pulling it down to a level where at least I can understand what's going on a little bit. But that is really, I think, number one. We've got to have a message that is communicated well to the community. The second thing is to identify the vulnerabilities that we can address and can improve. I mean, some things we can't do, at least probably not in my lifetime, but other things we can do. So if we can address those, identify them, and start to develop a plan for them over the course of the next year, I think that's really our primary goal. Certainly interested in others' comments. George? Oh, Mike.
Tom, can you zero in on the end of the Cove, Summer Street, Margin Street area? Can you blow that area up?
Yeah.
So the comment I'm going to make is sort of maybe putting the cart before the horse. But if I recall, the elevation just at the intersection of Elm and Margin Street, where the red dots are, the road elevation there, the survey is around 13. And down on the opposite side of the harbor or the hotel, down at the intersection of basically Border Street and Summer Street, where the ground, where the aerial photo here is brown, that's also up high, roughly, let's call it 13. It's probably even higher than that. So relative to Tim's comment about timing and addressing vulnerabilities early on, if possible, that would lead me to say, what, if anything, has been brought forward relative to the possible mitigation to cut off water? As you can see here, everything to the left of the hotel is vulnerable. But if you drew a line from the red dots at the top to the orange dots at the bottom, at the end of the cove, you have a barrier. So the question is, you only have to raise part of the orange dot road, but you have to have the condo development make sure that their entire harbor side land is also at plus 13 or 14, whatever the number wants to be. That only leaves mitigation to figure out how to solve the park, the Memorial Park, because that's at the same elevation as the road. Now, you might be able to build literally almost, let me call it, lack of a better term, a raised walkway dike system that's on the harbor side of the Memorial Park, which would then tie into the higher road elevation at Border Street, which ties into the higher ground where those homes are that are on sort of that curved driveway that is isolated from the actual intersection. But that would be the first place to look to cut off water, getting everything to the west of that, is to work with the developers and see what they have on their plans relative to elevations. I don't really remember seeing a grading plan for their condos, although I'm sure they have something. Everything's worked out in the vertical elevations for controls for the parking and the finished floors and all that stuff, I'm sure. But it'd be interesting to know what, if anything, is happening on the Cove side.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that, you know, you don't have to do this by raising a roadway. You can build a seawall, which is probably somewhat less expensive. The reason I kind of focused on the roads is we have to pave them from time to time, and it could be incorporated into that routine paving.
Well, we have, so we have that, let's call it that potential barrier, which protects everything to the west. And then you have the study that's going to happen over the next year or two that's related to the Captain's Walk, which is all of that yellow road along Border Street. I mean, part of the evaluation of the Captain's Walk has to do with resiliency, seawall heights, road elevations, adjacencies, all that stuff. So part of that Captain's Walk resolution, in quotes, might be that it's tied to raising the road some. And that's just basically protecting a few homes along there. But those are, and perhaps some of the other improvements that are on the harbor side, basically the Old Salt and Atlantica property, et cetera. So, I mean, some of these things go hand in hand with other planning that is occurring going forward. And that's why it's sort of a big deal to be thinking about this whole Cove edge, which includes the green dots up the north side, because the Captain's Walk really wants to create a walk along the seawall that's there, but there's no walk there yet. And so when you're doing that, you could raise that section of the road or part of that section of the road as well. So,
yeah, I mean, we all know that these are pretty vulnerable places here.
yes.
These definitely should be at least raised somewhat. I mean, they're critical for public safety to get out in this part of town. The number of residences that would be impacted by flooding of Lower Elm Street here, or eastern end of Elm Street, would prevent public safety from getting to these parts of town in a timely fashion.
Correct.
And in fact, you really do have to start thinking about what's going on over at Little Harbor when you start thinking about response times as well, because you have some issues over here that can make it difficult too. Beach Street has got a serious issue to get across here, and some areas that might only flood by a foot or so. It might not flood at all because of the size of the aperture at Little Harbor. Again, if Sandy Beach were to be breached, but this part of the roadway would almost certainly need to be raised, and there's also going to take a little bit to draw. I mean, there's also issues with Straits Pond that I know the current solution is to use the existing 18-inch conduit out to Sandy Cove. This might be an opportunity to revisit the Army Corps of Engineers study that suggested that the best way of treating this was to create a 4x8 box culvert that terminated here, and then get some tidal exchange here, clean up the pond. It would alleviate flooding. There's some serious vulnerabilities here. You can see these places would be hit really hard.
Hey, Tom.
There's no defense there that I can see. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to interject and maybe ask Tim. Jack Buckley's on here. I also wanted to give him a little bit of time to share his thoughts about what's being presented.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I think, this has been terrific. I have a bunch of questions and comments, but I will hold those for now. I don't want this to go all night. We do have a select board meeting tonight I've got to go to. So let's bring Jack in if he can. I see his logo there.
And Tom, thank you so much. I think we got the desired response, which is that your graphics do raise a lot of questions, and I think that it's headed a great direction. Jack,
I can't seem to get my camera to work, so forgive me for that. Has asked you to start your video. All right, let's see. I got a note saying start your video, but I already had that on. So I don't know if I can share my screen or not.
Sure, try. I think, Tom, you may have to release it, Tom, or you may have to stop sharing.
All right, so I'll be super fast. I just wanted to add a couple of things that I think might be a little bit helpful. The map that is on my screen here, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's just showing the watershed from a couple of different having the computer draw the watershed of James Brook, of the Gulf River, out by Squashkit Pond, Briggs Harbor, James Brook. I think I already said that. So the point being that which Tom already mentioned, and what is happening in the upper reaches of the watershed is only going to exacerbate the flooding that Tom had delineated and outlined. I think one of the things that might be helpful for people to see is, George, Tom, and I talked about this. What's it look like when you are on the water at a king tide? This was an 11/6 tide. This was student work. Jacob Reel and Susan Bryant and I went out. But you can see these pictures, pictures worth 1,000 words. They really show you, there's a sailing club at a beautiful sunny day, and it is literally lapping at the water's edge. And the talk about Mike talking about Margin Street. Here's Border Street. There's only that little parking barrier right there is keeping the water at bay. There's some cool, that's Margin Street right there. And we caught this a little bit after flood tide. And I have some other pics over by, over at the yacht club, where you can see the second jetty, the smaller jetty by the Bellarmine estate is almost submerged right there. So in terms of presentation material, there's some pictures here. Been playing around with taking some of the data that Tom has, and you can put these into an app that allows you to see some of that digital. You can get the elevation a little bit, and as you zoom in and zoom out, and change the orientation, you can put whatever data layers you want here for a viewer like that and spit it out so that people can look at it on their own computer or even their phone. So really the takeaway part that George, Tom, and I talked about was just reminding people that harbor resilience depends upon watershed awareness and watershed understanding, and planning for incorporating stormwater management, stormwater awareness, watershed awareness into harbor resilience. Because, as I said, and mentioned that Tom made the point as well, whatever's coming into the harbor is being met with equal force with what's coming down the pike. And it's screaming down the hillside of Forest Ave, and it is pouring down the Gulf River from North Situate, and everything that's coming down on that hillside from Wheelwright Park and Forest Ave is going right into James Brook. And then all of that water at Sanctuary Pond, at the headwaters of Sanctuary Pond, is trying to make its way out of the harbor. So, as Tom outlined different scenarios, who knows what combination of rain and storm surge, we might meet. But at the risk of saying it probably a third time, having that incorporating into the discussion what's happening upstream in the watershed is equally important, which I know everybody obviously understands that point. It was, I'm saying, I guess, in the spirit of if there is a public presentation, if there's a role for me to play in that, give some kudos to students who are doing some of the work, etc. That would be the point. That's it.
Great. Thanks, Jack. That's terrific. Any other comments from folks about where we are? It's the beginning of a long journey, but this is certainly a great first step. One thing I will just mention, and Tom, this is something I will keep in mind. I'm on the Elm Street Corridor Working Group, and we are presenting to the Select Board tonight. That hopefully is going to result eventually in pretty significant construction or reconstruction of Elm Street. So before the first shovel goes in, we got to look at that intersection down there. And if you don't mind, I'll call on several of you on this call to help looking at that and what we might be able to do. I'm sure the developers, George and Teddy, will be very amenable to working with us and talking about how we can improve that intersection down there, where intersection of Elm Street with Cove, Margin, and Border Street. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to thank Tom and Jack for the work that you've done and the work that's coming, and your efforts on behalf of the town of Cohasset. So thank you very much.
I agree. Thank you very much. And thank you all for participating. We will be seeing a lot of each other over the course of the next year. I hope we'll move this along. And Peter, thank you for bringing your group into this. This is most helpful, and hopefully other groups within Cohasset will join us as we go forward. With that, if I don't see you beforehand, have a Merry Christmas all, and we will be back together again in the first of the year.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you,
Happy New
everybody.
Year.
Thank you all.
Merry Christmas.